My name is Madison, I'm 28 years old, and I'm standing in what used to be my beautiful backyard watching potential buyers flee in absolute horror as muddy water floods everywhere around their expensive shoes. 3 years ago, I spent my grandmother's $50,000 inheritance creating the most stunning Japanese koi pond you've ever seen, complete with imported stones and 27 prize-winning fish. My parents told these buyers they had every right to sell my pond without my permission. But they had no idea what I'd discovered in Mom's bedroom that morning. Before we dive into this wild story of family betrayal and revenge, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you're ready for a tale about standing up to manipulative family members, smash that like button and subscribe for more stories about fighting back against toxic people. Trust me, you won't believe how far my parents were willing to go to destroy my happiness, and what I did to stop them will leave you speechless. Let's get into this mess. When my grandmother Evelyn passed away 2.5 years ago, she left me $50,000 with a very specific note that said it was for something beautiful that brings you joy, sweetheart. I knew exactly what she meant because when I was 12, Grandma Evelyn had taken me on a trip to Kyoto where we spent hours at this incredible temple with the most serene koi pond I'd ever seen. She watched me sit there for what felt like forever, mesmerized by these graceful fish swimming in crystal clear water surrounded by carefully placed stones and gentle waterfalls. That moment sparked a dream I'd carried for 16 years. Of course, my parents Richard and Diane had completely different ideas about what I should do with that inheritance. The moment the lawyer finished reading the will, Dad started his campaign about investing wisely, which really meant giving them the money for their struggling restaurant. Mom was more subtle but equally persistent, dropping hints about how frivolous purchases were a waste when I could be building my future or helping family members who were working so hard to make ends meet. Every conversation somehow circled back to how I should be more practical and responsible with Grandma's gift. But I stood firm because this wasn't just about money, it was about honoring my grandmother's memory and finally creating something that would bring me the same peace I'd felt in that temple garden. I hired a landscape architect named Trevor who specialized in authentic Japanese water features, and we spent weeks planning every detail. The pond would be 12 feet by 8 feet with a depth of 4 feet, featuring a custom filtration system that could handle the bio-load of multiple large koi, imported volcanic rocks from Mount Fuji arranged in traditional patterns, and a 3-tiered waterfall that would create the perfect sound for meditation. My parents' reaction to the construction project was immediate and relentless criticism disguised as concern for my well-being. Dad would walk through the backyard shaking his head dramatically, muttering about throwing money into a hole in the ground while Mom made passive-aggressive comments to neighbors about my expensive fish obsession and how some people don't understand the value of money. They scheduled conflicting contractors to show up on the same days as my pond builders, claiming it was an honest mistake when chaos ensued in my driveway with cement trucks and electrical workers trying to share the same space. The first real betrayal came when Mom called the homeowners association behind my back, reporting an unpermitted water feature that was supposedly violating neighborhood regulations. I came home from work one Tuesday to find a violation notice taped to my front door, threatening daily fines until I either removed the pond or obtained proper permits. The retroactive permitting process cost me an additional $3,000 and delayed construction by 6 weeks, during which time my parents expressed fake sympathy while clearly enjoying my frustration and stress. Despite their sabotage attempts, Trevor and his crew completed the most beautiful pond I could have imagined, and I spent another $8,000 carefully selecting 27 koi from a prestigious breeder in California. Each fish had its own personality and distinctive markings, from a massive sonk named Emperor who ruled the feeding sessions to a tiny kahaku called Sunrise whose orange patterns looked like flames dancing across her white scales. My daily routine became sacred time, sitting by the pond each morning with my coffee, watching these magnificent creatures glide through the water while the gentle waterfall drowned out the noise of the busy street beyond my fence. My best friend Sophia understood immediately why this pond meant so much to me, especially after the stress of my demanding marketing job left me feeling drained and anxious most days. She'd often join me for evening feeding sessions, and we'd talk about everything and nothing while the koi performed their dinner ballet, their movements hypnotic and soothing in ways that expensive therapy had never achieved. But my parents saw my daily pond ritual as evidence of my unhealthy obsession and continued their campaign of criticism, making snide remarks about how I spent more time with fish than people, as if finding peace in my own backyard was somehow shameful or wrong. 6 months after the pond's completion, my parents' restaurant started showing serious signs of financial trouble, with Dad complaining constantly about declining revenues, increased supply costs, and restaurant staff who demanded higher wages in a competitive market. That's when their comments about my $50,000 fish tank stopped being jokes and started carrying an edge of genuine resentment, as if my happiness was somehow responsible for their business struggles. Mom began bringing uninvited guests to admire the beautiful backyard landscaping, which I thought was strange until I realized these weren't friends or neighbors but complete strangers who spent suspicious amounts of time examining the pond's filtration system, taking photos of the stone arrangements, and asking detailed questions about maintenance requirements and operational costs. When I confronted my parents about these impromptu tours, Dad claimed they were just proud of their daughter's accomplishment and wanted to share it with people who appreciated fine craftsmanship. The confrontation that changed everything happened on a rainy Thursday evening when I overheard Mom on the phone discussing property values and unique water features with someone who definitely wasn't a friend. When I demanded an explanation, both parents launched into a coordinated argument about how they deserved compensation for raising me, providing me with a home to build the pond on, and supporting me through college so I could afford expensive hobbies. Dad's face turned red as he shouted about how they'd sacrificed everything for my education and future, while Mom added that successful children had obligations to help their parents during difficult times, especially when those children were wasting money on fish while family members struggled. I reminded them firmly that this was my house, inherited directly from Grandma Evelyn along with the money for the pond, meaning they had absolutely zero legal claim to either the property or the water feature I'd built on it. This fact seemed to infuriate them more than anything else I'd ever said, with Dad storming out of the room while muttering threats about ungrateful children and learning respect the hard way, while Mom's expression shifted into something cold and calculating that I'd never seen before. The second betrayal came through my younger brother Jake, who called me the next week with an emotional plea about family unity and how I should consider selling the pond to help our parents save their restaurant. Jake owed our parents $15,000 from a failed business venture, which explained his sudden concern for their financial well-being, but his guilt-tripping felt like a knife in the back from someone I'd always trusted. He kept repeating phrases like blood is thicker than water and family should come first, while I realized that my parents had recruited him as their spokesperson because they knew his opinion mattered to me. That's when I started noticing my parents researching pond removal companies on their laptop, leaving browser windows open with searches for koi relocation services and water feature demolition costs as if they wanted me to see what they were planning. The psychological warfare escalated when they invited contractors to give estimates for backyard renovation projects that would coincidentally require removing my pond to install new patio spaces or swimming pools, presenting these ideas as helpful suggestions for improving my property value. The third attack was the most devastating because it targeted my beloved koi directly rather than just threatening the pond structure. While I was working late one Tuesday, my parents claimed they'd noticed electrical problems with the pond's filtration system and had helpfully called an electrician to investigate. When I rushed home after their frantic phone call about emergency repairs, I found 3 of my most beautiful koi floating dead in water that smelled strongly of chemicals, while the electrician explained that someone had tampered with the pond's wiring in a way that created deadly electrical currents in the water. My parents' performance of shock and sympathy was Oscar-worthy, with Mom crying about how terrible accidents happen and Dad offering to pay for replacement fish as if emperor, sunrise, and midnight were just decorative objects that could be easily substituted. But I knew this wasn't an accident because the electrical damage was too specific and targeted to be random, and the timing was too convenient given their recent escalation of pressure about selling the pond. Sophia found me that night sitting by the pond in tears, mourning my fish while paranoia crept through my mind about what my parents might try next. She listened to the whole story of escalating threats and manipulation before saying something that changed my perspective completely. "Madison, they're not just trying to get money from you anymore. They're actively planning something big, and you need to protect yourself." Her words hit me like ice water because I realized that my parents weren't just being greedy or difficult, they were systematically working to destroy something that brought me joy, and their methods were becoming increasingly dangerous and illegal. The next morning, I installed security cameras around the pond area, telling my parents they were for insurance purposes after the electrical incident, but really wanting evidence of any future sabotage attempts. Their reaction to the cameras confirmed my suspicions because instead of supporting my efforts to protect the pond, they seemed nervous and angry about being monitored, with Dad muttering about trust issues and Mom making comments about how surveillance cameras made the backyard feel unwelcoming and paranoid. My growing suspicions proved justified when the pond maintenance company started asking strange questions during their monthly service visits, with the technician wondering about system transferability and whether the filtration equipment could be relocated to a different property without damage. These questions made no sense in the context of routine maintenance, so I pressed for details and discovered that someone had been calling the company asking about procedures for moving an entire pond operation to a new location. Further investigation revealed that my parents had been conducting private tours of my backyard for weeks, showing my pond to potential buyers while I was at work, telling these strangers that I was planning to relocate and wanted to sell the water feature quickly before moving. The maintenance company owner eventually admitted that he'd been contacted by several people inquiring about purchasing the koi pond setup on Maple Street along with professional relocation services. The fourth attack came in the form of a false insurance claim that my parents filed without my knowledge, reporting that my pond posed a dangerous liability to neighborhood children and requesting an immediate inspection to determine whether the water feature should be condemned for safety reasons. I only learned about this when an insurance investigator showed up at my door with official paperwork authorizing him to examine my property for potential hazards requiring immediate remediation. The investigator was professional but thorough, measuring the pond's depth, checking the fence height, and documenting every aspect of the installation while I frantically called my insurance company to understand what was happening. My parents had apparently told the insurance company that neighborhood children had been trespassing and playing dangerously near the water, creating liability concerns that required investigation. It took 3 hours of explanations, documentation, and witness statements from neighbors to convince the investigator that my pond was properly secured and posed no unusual risks to anyone. That weekend, I called my cousin Emma, who worked as a real estate attorney, to research my legal protections and understand exactly what rights my parents might have regarding my property. Emma's investigation uncovered something that made my blood run cold. My parents had somehow obtained and forged my signature on a preliminary sales agreement with a wealthy developer named Harrison Blackwood, who was specifically interested in purchasing my koi pond to relocate it to his private estate in the hills above the city. The forged documents were sophisticated enough to fool a casual observer, using letterhead from a fake property management company and including detailed specifications about the pond's dimensions, equipment, and fish population. Blackwood had apparently been planning to pay $60,000 for the complete pond system, with my parents receiving a $25,000 finder's fee for facilitating the transaction and handling the seller's relocation requirements. Emma's deeper research revealed that Blackwood was a legitimate businessman who collected exotic water features for his estate, but he had no idea that the sellers didn't actually own the pond they were offering. My parents had presented themselves as my representatives, claiming that I lived overseas and had authorized them to handle the sale while I focused on my international career transition. The third betrayal came from Carl, the pond maintenance company owner, who finally confessed that my parents had offered him $5,000 to accidentally damage the pond's filtration system beyond repair, creating an emergency situation that would force me to drain the pond and remove the fish. Carl said he'd been tempted by the money because his own business was struggling, but couldn't bring himself to destroy something so beautiful, especially after seeing how much joy it brought me during his monthly visits. This revelation hit me like a physical blow because it meant my parents weren't just trying to steal my pond, they were actively working to destroy it if they couldn't have it, as if my happiness was so offensive to them that they'd rather see everything ruined than allow me to keep enjoying my grandmother's gift. The realization that they'd recruited multiple people in their campaign against me showed a level of premeditation and malice that went far beyond normal family conflict. The final confrontation of this phase happened when I presented my parents with copies of the forged documents and evidence of their various sabotage attempts, demanding an explanation for their behavior. Instead of showing remorse or surprise at being caught, they became vicious and desperate, with Dad shouting that I thought I was better than my own family with my fancy fish and expensive hobbies, while Mom added that ungrateful children who refused to help their parents deserved whatever happened to them. But the most chilling moment came when Mom threatened to have me declared mentally unstable and petition for guardianship based on my obsessive behavior and inability to manage money responsibly, claiming that my attachment to the pond was evidence of psychological problems that required professional intervention. The fact that they'd researched legal ways to take control of my life and property showed that this was no longer about money or even the pond itself, but about power and control over a daughter who dared to set boundaries they couldn't accept. The morning after that devastating confrontation, I called Sophia and Emma for an emergency meeting to plan my defense against parents who'd clearly declared war on my independence and happiness. Emma brought legal documents showing the extent of my parents' deception, while Sophia provided emotional support and helped me think strategically about protecting both my pond and my sanity from people who'd proven they had no limits to their manipulation and sabotage. Emma's investigation into my parents' finances revealed the true scope of their desperation. They owed over $80,000 to various creditors, including some very unpleasant people who weren't interested in payment plans or negotiation. Dad's gambling addiction had escalated during the restaurant's decline, with casino debts adding another $30,000 to their financial crisis, while Mom had been using credit cards to cover basic living expenses, creating a debt spiral that threatened to destroy them completely. Understanding their financial desperation explained their increasingly aggressive behavior, but it also made them more dangerous because desperate people make desperate choices, as demonstrated by their willingness to commit fraud and destruction to access money that didn't belong to them. Emma warned me that financially cornered individuals often escalate their illegal behavior when initial schemes fail, meaning my parents would likely become more creative and ruthless in their attempts to liquidate my pond. The fifth attack came while I was working late on a crucial project presentation, when my parents used their emergency key to enter my house and dumped chlorine directly into the pond, apparently hoping to kill all the koi and make the entire system unusable. Only my security cameras and a neighbor's quick phone call saved most of my fish, as I raced home to find the water turning cloudy while my koi gasped near the surface, their gills burning from chemical exposure. The emergency pond flush and water replacement took 8 hours and cost $1,500 in emergency veterinary care for the affected fish, but more importantly, it proved that my parents had crossed the line from threats into actual assault on living creatures they knew I loved. This wasn't just about money anymore, it was about inflicting maximum emotional damage on a daughter who'd refused to submit to their financial demands and manipulation tactics. Emma's legal research uncovered an even more shocking development. My parents had scheduled the complete sale of my pond for the following Friday, planning to finalize the transaction with Blackwood while I was at work, using the forged documents to claim legal authority over the property. They'd told Blackwood that I was eager to complete the sale quickly before my supposed departure for a job in Europe, creating urgency that would prevent him from asking too many questions about the legitimacy of their claims. This discovery triggered immediate action planning because I had less than a week to prevent the theft of my pond and expose my parents' fraud before they disappeared with Blackwood's money and left me to deal with the legal consequences of their deception. Emma prepared injunction paperwork while I gathered evidence of the forgery, sabotage attempts, and threats, building a case that would not only stop the sale but potentially result in criminal charges against my parents. My first ally in this battle was Trevor, the landscape architect who'd built my pond and maintained detailed records of every aspect of the construction process. When I explained what my parents were planning, Trevor immediately offered to help by providing documentation proving that I was the sole owner and decision-maker for the pond project, plus he agreed to be available as an expert witness regarding the installation's value and complexity. My second ally was Mrs. Chen, the elderly neighbor who'd witnessed many of my parents' suspicious activities over the previous months, including their unauthorized tours of strangers through my backyard and their conversations about getting rid of that expensive fish pond before it causes more problems. Mrs. Chen had been keeping notes about these incidents in her diary because she found their behavior concerning and potentially illegal. During this preparation phase, I made the strategic decision to pretend surrender, telling my parents that I was finally ready to consider selling and would think seriously about their advice regarding the pond's future. This performance required significant emotional control because every word felt like betrayal of my grandmother's memory and my own dreams, but I needed them to believe they'd won so they wouldn't change their plans or become more secretive about their activities. My parents' reaction to my apparent surrender was revealing because instead of showing relief or gratitude, they seemed almost disappointed that I wasn't fighting harder, as if the conflict itself had become more important to them than the financial outcome. Mom's response was particularly chilling when she said, "It's about time you learned that family comes first, Madison, and sometimes that means sacrificing things that don't really matter anyway." The final preparation involved documenting everything with timestamps, photos, and witness statements, creating an evidence package that would demonstrate the systematic nature of my parents' campaign against me. Emma emphasized that we needed to prove not just the immediate fraud but the pattern of escalating harassment and sabotage that had led to this moment, showing that their behavior constituted a deliberate attempt to steal my property through intimidation and deception. Thursday night, I discovered through my security system that my parents were implementing their plan ahead of schedule, with trucks and equipment already being positioned for a Friday morning operation that would begin at 8 a.m., 2 hours earlier than I'd been told. This acceleration meant they suspected my surrender wasn't genuine and were trying to complete the theft before I could mount any defense. When I arrived at my house Friday morning, I found that my parents had changed the locks overnight, effectively locking me out of my own property while claiming to anyone who asked that I no longer lived there and had given them permission to handle the pond's sale. The audacity of this move left me stunned and furious, watching from the sidewalk as strangers walked through my backyard examining my beloved pond like it was merchandise in a store. The first near defeat came when security guards hired by my parents prevented me from entering my own property, presenting official-looking documents that supposedly authorized them to maintain site security during property transfer proceedings. These guards were professional and polite but absolutely firm about keeping me away from the house, while my parents stood behind them looking triumphant and vindicated. My desperate call to Emma revealed devastating news that made my situation almost hopeless. My parents had located an old power of attorney document from when my grandmother was ill, and although it had expired years ago, they were using it to claim legal authority over property decisions related to grandmother's estate, including the house and anything built on it with inheritance money. Watching from across the street, I felt completely powerless as Harrison Blackwood arrived with his team of appraisers, pond specialists, and moving equipment, while my parents played the role of helpful sellers eager to facilitate a smooth transaction. They gave Blackwood and his people a detailed tour of the pond system, explaining the filtration setup, introducing each koi by name as if they were beloved family pets, and discussing timeline logistics for the relocation process. The second near defeat came when police officers arrived after my parents called them, claiming that I was trespassing and harassing potential buyers in violation of a restraining order that apparently didn't exist but sounded official enough to make the officers take their complaint seriously. Standing on a public sidewalk while being questioned about my right to be near my own house felt like the ultimate humiliation and proof that my parents had thought of everything. From my position behind the police car, I watched the most heartbreaking scene of my life as Blackwood's pond specialist began testing water quality and discussing procedures for safely transporting my koi to their new location. These strangers were handling my fish with professional competence but no emotional connection, treating Emperor and Sunrise and all the others like valuable livestock being prepared for shipping rather than individual creatures with personalities and history. The darkest moment came when I overheard Blackwood telling his team that they would completely gut the current system and rebuild it properly at his estate, meaning that even if I somehow stopped this sale, my pond would be destroyed in the removal process, And my fish would either die from the stress of relocation or live their remaining lives in a completely different environment designed by someone who'd never watched them perform their morning feeding ballet. My parents' celebration was visible even from across the street, with Dad counting money from Blackwood's down payment while Mom pointed out various features of the pond system as if she'd designed it herself, occasionally glancing in my direction with expressions of satisfaction and vindication. They'd achieved their goal of making me feel completely powerless and defeated, watching my dreams being dismantled by strangers while I stood helpless behind police barriers. Standing there in that moment of complete defeat, I realized that my parents hadn't just wanted the money from selling my pond, they'd wanted to prove they could still control and punish me for daring to create something beautiful without their permission or approval. This was never about financial necessity or family loyalty, it was about power and the message that disobedient daughters don't deserve happiness that parents can't share or control. The breaking point came when I heard Blackwood discussing timeline logistics with his crew, planning to begin drainage and dismantling within the hour, with complete removal scheduled for the following week. My koi would be transferred to temporary holding tanks today, spending their final night at my house in cramped containers before being trucked away to live or die in a completely alien environment designed by someone who saw them as decorative objects rather than living beings with needs and personalities. But sometimes the moment of greatest defeat becomes the catalyst for the most unexpected victory, and standing there watching my parents sell my dreams to strangers, I remembered something Trevor had told me during the pond's construction that would change everything. Hidden within the pond's design was an emergency drainage system that could be activated manually, turning my beautiful water garden into an unusable mud pit within minutes, and if my parents wanted to play dirty, I could play dirtier than they'd ever imagined. My breakthrough came when I realized that while my parents had blocked my access through the front door, they'd forgotten about the basement entrance that connected to the utility room where I kept backup documentation for all my home improvements, including Trevor's detailed pond specifications and emergency protocols. Using my neighbor's yard to access my basement undetected, I retrieved the evidence that would expose my parents' fraud and discovered something even more damaging in their bedroom. Hidden in Mom's jewelry box were documents proving that their scheming had been going on for over a year, including research into my mental health history, consultations with lawyers about guardianship procedures, and detailed financial projections showing how much money they could access by gaining control over my inheritance and property. They'd been planning this systematic destruction of my independence since the day my pond was completed, viewing my happiness as a threat to their authority that needed to be eliminated. The most chilling discovery was a folder containing my parents' research into my daily routines, work schedule, and social connections, along with notes about how to isolate me from friends and support systems who might interfere with their plans. They'd been studying me like a target for months, documenting my vulnerabilities and planning psychological attacks designed to break down my confidence and resistance to their demands. But the basement also contained evidence that vindicated my suspicions about their desperate financial situation. Gambling debts to dangerous people who'd made specific threats about consequences for continued non-payment, loan documents with terms that would destroy them financially if they defaulted, and correspondence with debt collectors who'd begun legal proceedings to seize their restaurant and personal assets. Understanding the full scope of their desperation helped me realize that my parents weren't just greedy or controlling, they were genuinely terrified of the consequences of their financial choices and saw my pond as their only escape route from a situation that threatened their safety and freedom. This knowledge didn't excuse their behavior, but it explained why they'd been willing to commit increasingly serious crimes to access money that belonged to me. Armed with this evidence and Trevor's emergency protocols, I called him with a simple message: "Remember that drainage system we discussed for maintenance emergencies? Today would be a good time to implement it." Trevor understood immediately what I was planning and why it was necessary, agreeing to meet me at the utility access point behind my garage where the manual drainage controls were located. My alliance with Carl, the maintenance company owner, proved crucial when he revealed that my parents had approached him that very morning with a final bribe offer, $10,000 to accidentally damage the drainage system so that Blackwood's team couldn't properly empty the pond, creating chaos that would delay the sale and give them time to negotiate a higher price or find a backup buyer if this deal fell through. Carl's information confirmed that my parents had contingency plans within contingency plans, viewing the sale to Blackwood as just one option among many for monetizing my pond, with backup schemes involving insurance fraud, legal manipulation, and outright theft if their preferred approach didn't succeed. They'd become so focused on accessing my inheritance money that they'd lost sight of legal and ethical boundaries entirely. This conversation with Carl also revealed something important about my parents' psychology. They'd become so invested in defeating me that the money had become secondary to proving they could still control my life and choices. Carl said Dad had laughed while discussing the bribe offer, saying it would be hilarious to watch Madison's face when her precious fish pond becomes a muddy hole in the ground. The final piece of evidence I needed was confirmation that Blackwood was an innocent victim of my parents' fraud rather than a willing participant in their scheme to steal my property. Carl's interaction with Blackwood's team had convinced him that these were legitimate businesspeople who believed they were purchasing pond legally from authorized sellers, meaning they would be horrified to learn they'd been deceived into participating in theft. With all the evidence gathered and Trevor standing by with emergency drainage protocols, I realized that my parents had made a crucial mistake in their overconfidence. They'd stopped monitoring me carefully because they believed I'd been defeated and marginalized, giving me the freedom to prepare a counterattack they'd never see coming. Their assumption that I would remain passive and helpless while they dismantled my dreams would prove to be the weakness that destroyed their carefully laid plans. My final decision came down to a heartbreaking choice: save my pond by exposing the fraud and hoping legal intervention could stop the sale, or destroy it myself to ensure that my parents couldn't profit from their theft and manipulation. The evidence suggested that even if I stopped this particular sale, my parents would continue their campaign of sabotage and harassment until they either succeeded in stealing my pond or destroyed it completely, making this my last opportunity to take control of the situation on my own terms. Standing in my basement with documentation of months of systematic betrayal and abuse, I realized that my parents had already destroyed the thing I loved most by turning it from a source of peace and joy into a battlefield where every day brought new threats and anxiety. Whether I saved the physical pond or not, they'd already accomplished their goal of poisoning my happiness and proving that nothing I created was safe from their interference and control. At exactly 9:15 a.m., while Blackwood and his team conducted their final inspection of the pond and my parents counted down payment money on my back patio, I made my way to the utility access point where Trevor had installed manual drainage controls designed for emergency maintenance situations. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was about to use my pond's own safety features to destroy it, but sometimes protecting something means accepting that it can't be saved in its current form. The manual drainage system was designed to empty the pond completely within 20 minutes by opening concealed valves that would channel 12,000 gallons of water directly into the storm drainage system, leaving behind only muddy sediment and confused koi flopping in shallow puddles. Trevor had insisted on this feature during construction in case the pond ever needed emergency repair or cleaning, never imagining it would be used to prevent theft. From my hidden position behind the garage, I could hear Blackwood's enthusiastic comments about the pond's construction quality and his plans for incorporating the design elements into his estate's existing water garden complex. His genuine appreciation for the craftsmanship made my task more difficult because he seemed like a decent person who'd been deceived into participating in my parents' fraud, but stopping his transaction was the only way to expose their crimes. My parents were performing beautifully as helpful sellers, with Mom explaining the feeding schedule for each koi while Dad demonstrated the filtration system's operation, both of them radiating satisfaction at finally achieving their goal of liquidating my inheritance for their own purposes. Their convincing portrayal of concerned family members handling property affairs for a relocated daughter showed how much planning and rehearsal had gone into this elaborate deception. The moment of no return came when I heard Blackwood's pond specialist begin discussing drainage procedures for safely removing the fish, describing the temporary holding tanks they'd brought and the timeline for beginning the relocation process. These were my final seconds to decide between attempting legal intervention that might fail and taking direct action that would definitely prevent the theft, regardless of the cost to everything I'd built. My hand trembling with emotion and determination, I opened the first drainage valve, immediately hearing the sound of rushing water as thousands of gallons began flowing out of my beautiful pond through concealed outlets that most people didn't even know existed. The sound was both heartbreaking and liberating because every gallon that disappeared represented another step away from my parents' control and toward taking responsibility for my own protection. The chaos began within minutes as the pond's water level dropped visibly and Blackwood's team noticed something was seriously wrong with the system they'd been preparing to purchase. Shouts of confusion and alarm came from the backyard as the crystal-clear water turned muddy brown and the carefully arranged stones began emerging like ancient ruins from a retreating flood, while my prized koi swam in increasingly desperate circles as their habitat disappeared around them. I emerged from behind the garage with Emma's evidence folder in my hands, walking calmly through the muddy disaster zone that had been my backyard paradise just minutes earlier, while Blackwood and his team stared in shock at the transformation of a pristine water garden into what looked like a construction site disaster. My parents' faces showed pure horror as they realized their carefully planned sale was collapsing in real time, along with their dreams of financial rescue. Before anyone signs any documents or transfers any money, I announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "You should know this sale is completely fraudulent and these people have no legal authority to sell my pond or anything else on my property." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of continuing drainage and the splash of confused koi in rapidly shrinking pools of muddy water. Blackwood's immediate anger was directed at my parents rather than me as the situation became clear, demanding explanations for why he'd been brought to examine property that wasn't actually for sale and threatening legal action against anyone who'd wasted his time and resources with false pretenses. His pond specialist quickly began emergency procedures to save the koi, setting up temporary aeration systems and transferring fish to the holding tanks they'd brought for the planned relocation. My parents' desperate attempts to maintain their deception crumbled as Emma arrived with police officers and court documents, including the injunction stopping any property transfers and evidence of forged signatures on the preliminary sales agreements. Dad's shouting about my mental instability and dangerous behavior sounded increasingly hysterical as the legal reality of fraud charges became apparent to everyone present. The complete exposure of months of planning and manipulation felt both devastating and liberating as neighbors gathered to witness the confrontation. Police officers examined forged documents, and Blackwood's team worked to save my koi while expressing amazement at the elaborate fraud they'd unknowingly participated in. My parents stood in the muddy remains of my backyard looking shocked and defeated, their careful plans destroyed by the daughter they'd underestimated. Emma's presentation of evidence to the police was methodical and devastating, including documentation of forged signatures, recorded threats, photographic evidence of sabotage attempts, and witness statements from neighbors and service providers who'd been approached with various bribery schemes. The scope of my parents' campaign against me was laid out in detail that made their claims about my mental state seem absurd by comparison. My bittersweet victory was complete when Blackwood formally withdrew from the transaction and began discussing potential legal action against my parents for fraud and misrepresentation, while police officers explained the criminal charges they would face for forgery, theft, and conspiracy. Standing in the ruins of my beloved pond, surrounded by evidence of family betrayal, I felt simultaneously heartbroken about what I'd lost and empowered by what I'd gained. Freedom from people who'd proven they would stop at nothing to control and diminish me. The legal aftermath moved swiftly once Emma presented our evidence package to the district attorney's office, with fraud charges filed against my parents within a week and additional charges for attempted theft, harassment, and conspiracy added as investigators uncovered the full scope of their planning and manipulation. Dad's reaction to the formal charges was explosive rage directed at me for destroying the family, while Mom maintained an injured innocence act that fooled no one who'd seen the evidence. My civil lawsuit against my parents for emotional distress, property damage, and financial losses from their sabotage campaign proceeded simultaneously with criminal charges, with Emma confident that we could recover substantial damages for the months of harassment, the cost of repairing their various sabotage attempts, and compensation for the trauma of systematic family betrayal. The financial pressure from legal fees and potential judgments added to their existing debt crisis, making their situation increasingly desperate. Blackwood's withdrawal from the fraudulent deal was followed by his own lawsuit against my parents for misrepresentation and wasted resources, including the cost of bringing his specialized team and equipment to examine property that wasn't actually for sale. His attorney's investigation revealed that my parents had approached multiple potential buyers with similar schemes, suggesting a pattern of fraud that could result in federal charges if they'd crossed state lines with their deception. The scandal destroyed what remained of my parents' restaurant business as word spread through our small business community about criminal fraud charges and their willingness to steal from their own daughter. Former customers and suppliers distanced themselves from people who'd proven capable of elaborate deception and manipulation, while business partners demanded immediate repayment of outstanding debts to avoid association with criminal defendants. Community reaction was overwhelmingly supportive of me and horrified by my parents' behavior, with neighbors expressing shock that people they'd known for years could plan such systematic abuse of their own child. Mrs. Chin organized a neighborhood collection to help with pond restoration costs, while other neighbors offered security assistance and witness testimony for any future legal proceedings. My grief process was complicated because I wasn't just mourning the destroyed pond but also the loss of parents who'd revealed themselves to be people capable of extraordinary cruelty and manipulation. The pond could eventually be rebuilt, but my relationship with my parents had been permanently damaged by their choice to view my happiness as a threat that needed to be eliminated rather than something to celebrate and protect. Jake's attempted reconciliation came with apologies for his role in pressuring me to sell the pond, along with admissions that our parents had manipulated him using his debt situation and guilt about not contributing more to family financial stability. His growing understanding of their true character led him to distance himself from their legal troubles and offer support for my recovery process, though our relationship would need time and work to fully heal. My parents' brief attempt at reconciliation was pathetic and insulting, with Dad claiming he'd only wanted to help me make better financial decisions while Mom insisted that families sometimes disagree about money but still love each other. Their complete inability to acknowledge the criminality and cruelty of their behavior made reconciliation impossible and confirmed my decision to maintain strict boundaries regardless of legal outcomes. The therapy journey that followed was essential for processing the trauma of discovering that my own parents had spent months planning to destroy my happiness and independence, viewing my success and joy as personal attacks that required retaliation. Understanding the psychology behind their behavior helped me realize that their actions reflected their own failures and insecurities rather than any genuine problems with my choices or character. Sophia's friendship proved invaluable during this difficult period, providing emotional support and practical assistance while reminding me that chosen family often proves more reliable and loving than biological relatives who feel entitled to control and diminish us. Her unwavering loyalty contrasted sharply with my parents' conditional love that evaporated the moment I refused to submit to their demands. The insurance investigation cleared me of any wrongdoing while confirming that my parents had indeed filed false claims and attempted to manipulate the process for their own financial benefit. The insurance company's decision to pursue fraud charges against them added another layer to their legal troubles while validating my suspicions about the systematic nature of their campaign against me. My parents' forced sale of their restaurant to pay mounting legal fees and civil judgments felt like poetic justice, but I took no pleasure in their financial destruction because it represented the natural consequences of their own choices rather than any vindictive action on my part. They'd created their crisis through gambling, poor business decisions, and ultimately through criminal behavior designed to steal from me rather than address their problems honestly. The gradual healing process involved learning to trust my own judgment again after months of gaslighting and manipulation designed to make me question my perceptions and decisions. Emma's legal expertise had protected my rights and property, but the emotional recovery from family betrayal required time, therapy, and the support of people who genuinely cared about my well-being rather than viewing me as a source of money or control. 6 months after watching my beautiful pond drain away while my parents' fraud collapsed around them, I stood in the same backyard planning the construction of what Trevor enthusiastically called Pond 2.0, a bigger and better water garden that would incorporate lessons learned from the original design while adding security features and emergency protocols that would protect my investment from future sabotage attempts. The healing process had been painful and slow, but it had also revealed strengths and capabilities I'd never known I possessed. The decision to rebuild came after weeks of therapy sessions exploring my complicated feelings about recreating something that had been so violently taken from me, versus starting completely fresh with a different approach to backyard landscaping. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that rebuilding the pond wasn't about replacing what I'd lost, but about reclaiming my right to create beauty and find peace in my own space without fear of interference or destruction from people who should have supported and protected my dreams. Trevor's design for the new pond incorporated sophisticated security systems including motion sensors, reinforced electrical components housed in tamper-proof enclosures, and drainage controls that could only be operated with special tools kept in a secure location. The new filtration system was designed to be completely self-contained and independent, eliminating any potential access points for sabotage while actually improving water quality and maintenance efficiency. The community celebration of the pond's reconstruction was deeply moving, with neighbors contributing plants, decorative stones, and volunteer labor to help restore something that had become a symbol of resilience against family abuse and manipulation. Mrs. Chen brought a beautiful flowering tree that she planted beside the pond for shade and protection, while other neighbors offered ongoing security assistance and friendship that proved chosen community could be stronger than blood relatives. My career advancement during this challenging period surprised everyone, including myself, as the confidence and assertiveness I developed while fighting my parents translated into professional success and recognition from supervisors who noticed my improved decision-making and leadership skills. The promotion to senior marketing director came with increased responsibilities and financial security that made me completely independent from any potential future family pressure or manipulation. The relationship with David began slowly and carefully, built on honesty about my family situation and clear boundaries about respecting my independence and decision-making authority. His genuine admiration for my strength in standing up to systematic abuse, combined with his own healthy relationship with supportive parents, helped me understand what normal family dynamics should look like and gave me hope for creating chosen family connections based on mutual respect rather than control. Sophia's observation that I'd become completely different from the person who used to let them walk all over you felt accurate and empowering, reflecting the transformation from someone who'd been trained to prioritize family peace over personal well-being into someone capable of protecting my own interests and happiness regardless of outside pressure. The scared, guilt-ridden daughter who'd once apologized for having nice things had been replaced by a woman who understood her worth and refused to accept less. The new koi selection process was deeply meaningful, with each fish chosen to represent different aspects of resilience, renewal, and hope for the future rather than simply aesthetic preferences. Emperor II was a magnificent song whose bold patterns reminded me that strength could be beautiful, while Phoenix was a stunning kahaku whose orange markings looked like flames of renewal rising from white foundations of peace and clarity. My parents' rare visits to see the reconstructed pond were awkward but civil, with no apologies offered but also no attempts to resume their campaign of manipulation and control. Dad's grudging admission that the new pond was even nicer than before felt like the closest thing to approval I was likely to receive, while Mom's silence suggested either acceptance or strategic planning for future interference that I was now prepared to handle. The deep lesson about self-worth that emerged from this entire experience was that happiness and success don't require permission or approval from family members who view your joy as a personal attack on their own failures and limitations. Grandmother Evelyn's $50,000 hadn't just purchased a pond, it had bought me the education that some people will always try to destroy what they can't control, and protecting yourself from that destruction is not selfish or ungrateful but necessary for survival and growth. Standing by my rebuilt pond at sunrise, watching new koi perform their morning feeding ballet while water cascaded gently over stones arranged exactly as I'd envisioned, I understood that the real inheritance from my grandmother hadn't been money but the example of creating beauty in your own life regardless of other people's opinions or interference. The pond was just water and fish and rocks, but it represented something much more important. The right to pursue happiness without apology or compromise. The final reflection on this journey brought surprising gratitude for lessons learned through pain and conflict, Because without my parents' betrayal, I might never have discovered my own strength or learned to distinguish between people who deserve access to my life and those who forfeited that privilege through their choices and actions. The pond would always remind me that some things are worth fighting for, and I am one of them. Looking toward the future with David beside me and Sophia planning her wedding celebration in my backyard next spring, I realized that my parents' greatest failure had been their inability to understand that trying to diminish someone's light doesn't make your own shine brighter. They'd lost a daughter who would have freely shared her success and happiness, and gained nothing except legal troubles and community shame that reflected their character rather than mine. The contemplative ending of this story isn't about forgiveness or reconciliation because some betrayals are too fundamental to overcome, but about acceptance that family relationships have limits and conditions that must be respected for everyone's well-being. Choosing happiness over family approval wasn't selfish or cruel, it was necessary self-preservation that allowed me to become the person my grandmother had always believed I could be. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and protecting your own dreams? What would you do if the people closest to you tried to destroy something that brought you peace and joy? Share your thoughts in the comments below because everyone deserves support when facing difficult family dynamics. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming family manipulation and finding the strength to protect your happiness. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who might need encouragement to stand up for themselves against toxic family pressure. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that your dreams and happiness matter just as much as anyone else's, regardless of what family members might tell you. May you always have the courage to protect what brings you joy and the wisdom to know that you're worth fighting for.